The storm raged on, sheets of rain pounding against the windshield as Caldwell fought to keep his car steady on the winding back road. This was not how his night was supposed to go. His private jet had been grounded due to the sudden storm, and the nearest five-star hotel was miles away. So, against his better judgment, he'd rented a car and started driving toward the nearest town only for the downpour to turn the roads into a slippery mess. And now, to top it all off, his car sputtered once, twice then died completely. "Unbelievable," he muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. He grabbed his phone, but of course, there was no signal. Perfect. Just perfect. Stepping out of the car, the rain immediately soaked through his expensive suit, chilling him to the bone. He glanced around, spotting a faint glow through the trees. A house. His only option. Grimacing, he trudged through the mud, his Italian leather shoes ruined with each step. By the time he reached the front porch, he looked nothing like the polished CEO of Caldwell Enterprises. He was drenched, cold, and irritated beyond belief. He knocked hard, unsure if anyone was even awake at this hour. After a few seconds, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with wide, surprised eyes. She was barefoot, wearing an oversized sweater that slid off one shoulder, her brown hair tumbling in soft waves. Her gaze flickered over him, taking in his soaked clothes, the mud smeared on his pants. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. "My car broke down," Graham said, his voice tight. "I need to use a phone, or at least get out of this rain." She hesitated, clearly debating whether letting a stranger into her house was a good idea. Then, with a small sigh, she stepped back. "Come in before you freeze to death." Graham didn't hesitate. He stepped into the warmth of the house, dripping onto the hardwood floor. The inside was cozy, soft lighting, the scent of something sweet lingering in the air. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting a golden glow across the room. "You look miserable," she said, shutting the door. "Give me a second." Before he could respond, she disappeared down the hall. He stood awkwardly, shaking off his wet jacket. She returned a moment later with a towel and a dry t-shirt. "Bathrooms down the hall. You should change before you catch pneumonia." Graham hesitated. He wasn't used to strangers offering him things at least, not without expecting something in return. But he wasn't in a position to refuse. "Thanks," he said gruffly, taking the clothes. Once he changed, the warmth of the house finally started to sink into his bones. He walked back into the living room, where she was stirring something in a mug. "Hot chocolate," she said, handing it to him. "I figured you could use something warm." Graham took it, watching her as she settled into the armchair across from him. There was something about her an ease, an openness that felt foreign to him. "I'm Graham, by the way," he said, realizing he hadn't even introduced himself. She smiled, tucking her legs beneath her. "Hazel, do you live here alone?" he asked. She nodded. "Yep, moved here a few years ago, needed a change of pace." Graham studied her. There was something about the way she said it, like she was running from something, but he didn't press. "You don't seem like you're from around here," she said, tilting her head. Graham almost laughed. "That obvious?" She gestured to his abandoned suit jacket. "You walked in looking like a Wall Street executive who took a wrong turn." She wasn't far off. But he didn't correct her. He wasn't in the mood to explain who he was or why he was stranded in the middle of nowhere. "So, what do you do, Graham?" "I run a company," he said vaguely. Hazel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds suspiciously vague," he smirked. "And what about you? What do you do, Hazel?" She grinned. "I own a bakery." That caught him off guard. "A bakery." "Yeah," she said, stretching her legs. "Best cinnamon rolls in town, not to brag or anything." Graham chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He hadn't expected to enjoy the conversation, but there was something refreshing about Hazel. She didn't seem interested in impressing him or prying into his life. Well, I guess I'll have to try one of these famous cinnamon rolls, he said. Hazel laughed. You'll have to wait until morning. Kitchen's closed for the night. For the first time in hours, Graham felt something other than frustration. He felt comfortable. Maybe being stranded wasn't the worst thing after all. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. Graham stirred, momentarily disoriented by his surroundings. He wasn't in one of his high-end hotels, nor was he in his penthouse overlooking the city skyline. Instead, he was on a couch in a warm but unfamiliar living room, wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla. Then it all came back: the rain, the broken-down car, Hazel. He sat up, stretching the stiffness from his muscles. The scent of something sweet drifted in from the kitchen, and his stomach clenched, reminding him he hadn't eaten since early the previous evening. He ran a hand through his hair before standing, following the smell. Hazel was at the stove, her back to him, humming softly as she worked. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the wisps of hair that had escaped her messy bun. She wore a loose button-up shirt over leggings, her bare feet tapping lightly against the wooden floor as she moved between the counter and the stove. She glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "You survived the night." "Barely," he said, his voice still rough from sleep, "but I think I owe that to your hot chocolate." She laughed, turning back to flip something on the griddle. "Well, I figured you'd need something warm after standing in that downpour looking like a drowned executive." He leaned against the doorway, taking in the space. The kitchen was cozy, but well-loved flour dusted the counter. A mixing bowl sat half full beside a rolling pin, and a tray of golden cinnamon rolls cooled on a rack. It was nothing like the sleek, minimalist kitchens in his many properties. This one actually felt lived in. "You make all this yourself?" he asked, nodding toward the cinnamon rolls. Hazel slid a pancake onto a plate before turning to face him fully. "Yep, it's what I do for a living, remember? Right, the bakery." He folded his arms. "You work alone," she hesitated, as if debating how much to say. "Mostly, it's a small shop, but it's mine." Graham knew what it was like to build something from the ground up. He respected that. "Sit," she said, nodding toward the table. "You look like you could use a real breakfast." He didn't argue. He pulled out a chair as she placed a plate in front of him: fluffy pancakes, crisp bacon, and a cinnamon roll drizzled with icing. He wasn't used to home-cooked meals. His usual mornings consisted of protein shakes or high-end restaurant breakfasts that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. But this smelled like something from a childhood he never had. Hazel sat across from him, watching as he took his first bite. The pancake was light, buttery, with just the right amount of sweetness. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until now. "Okay," he admitted after a few bites. "I see why your bakery has a reputation." She smirked. "Told you?" They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional clatter of forks against plates and the soft hum of the radio in the background. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world damp and fresh. "So," Hazel said after a moment, "what's the plan? Is someone coming to get you?" Graham exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "No signal out here, remember?" She frowned. "Right. Landline's in the hallway if you need it." He nodded, making a mental note to call his assistant as soon as he finished eating. He needed a tow truck, a new rental, and possibly a helicopter if he wanted to avoid another disaster on these back roads. But for some reason, he wasn't in a rush. "You don't seem too eager to leave," Hazel observed, tilting her head. Graham smirked. "Maybe I'm just enjoying the hospitality." She rolled her eyes. "Or maybe you're just not used to slowing down." That struck a little too close to home. He wasn't used to slowing down ever. His life was a constant cycle of meetings, negotiations, and decisions that affected thousands of employees. There was no time for quiet mornings or homemade breakfasts. Hazel stood, gathering their plates. "Come on, if you're stuck here for a little while, you might as well make yourself useful." He raised an eyebrow. "I don't do dishes." She handed him a towel anyway. "You do today." And somehow, despite himself, Graham found himself standing at the sink, drying plates while Hazel washed. It was absurd, completely out of character for a man who had people to handle things like this for him. But as the warm water ran and Hazel bumped her hip against his playfully when he didn't move fast enough, he found himself smiling. Maybe, just for a little while, being stranded wasn't so bad after all. Graham stepped outside, blinking against the pale morning light. The rain had left everything in a cool haze, droplets still clinging to the trees, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. He took in the quiet surroundings, noting the small garden along the side of Hazel's house, its leafy herbs still heavy with rain. The place had an undeniable charm, so different from the sleek, polished world he was accustomed to. He pulled out his phone, frowning when he saw there was still no signal. With a sigh, he turned back toward the house, only to find Hazel leaning against the doorframe, watching him with a knowing expression. "Still nothing?" she asked. "Not a single bar," he admitted. She nodded toward the side of the house. "If you walk up the hill behind the barn, you might get a signal there. It's where I go when I need to make a call that won't cut out halfway through." Graham followed her direction, making his way past the small red barn behind the property. The incline wasn't steep, but the ground was still slick from the storm, and more than once he had to steady himself against a tree. At the top, he finally caught a weak signal. He called his assistant, relaying the situation in clipped tones. A tow truck was dispatched, but it would take a few hours. That meant he was stuck here a little longer. As he made his way back down, he spotted Hazel standing near the barn, tossing feed to a small flock of chickens. He paused, watching as she moved with an ease that suggested this life suited her. "You look like you're considering making a career change," she teased when she noticed him. He smirked. "I don't think I'd last a day," she laughed. "Probably not." "But you'd look good in an apron." He shook his head, stepping closer. "Tow truck's on its way. A few more hours and I'll be out of your hair." Hazel tilted her head, considering him. "You say that like you're in a rush." Graham hesitated. He should be in a rush. He had meetings waiting, a business to run. And yet, standing here with the scent of fresh earth and the distant hum of birds, he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of ease. "Just used to things moving fast," he said finally. She studied him for a moment before nodding toward the barn. "Come on, since you're stuck here, might as well make yourself useful." He raised an eyebrow. "I already did the dishes." "And now you get to experience farm life," she said, handing him a basket. Graham looked at it warily. "What exactly am I supposed to do with this?" "Eggs," she said simply, nodding toward the chickens. He glanced at the birds, which eyed him with what he could only assume was suspicion. "You want me to stick my hands under them?" Hazel laughed, clearly enjoying his discomfort. "It's not as terrifying as you think. Just be gentle." Graham sighed but crouched down, carefully reaching beneath one of the hens. The bird squawked, flapping its wings, and he jerked back. Hazel was laughing too hard to be helpful. "You're enjoying this way too much," he muttered. She wiped at her eyes. "You're just so out of your element. It's refreshing." He huffed but tried again. This time he successfully retrieved an egg, holding it up like a trophy. "There you go," she said approvingly. They worked together, gathering the rest. Despite himself, Graham found the task oddly satisfying. Hazel had a way of making even the simplest things feel purposeful. As they walked back toward the house, she glanced at him. "So, CEO, must be a lot of pressure," he shrugged. "Comes with the territory. You don't seem like the type who takes breaks often." "I don't," he admitted. Hazel looked thoughtful. "Maybe you should." He didn't have an answer for that. They reached the house and Hazel set the basket down on the counter. She moved with practiced efficiency, cracking eggs into a bowl, whisking them with precision. "You're not going to make me cook, are you?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "I wouldn't trust you with my kitchen," she said with a smirk. He watched as she worked, the rhythmic motion of her hands oddly soothing. There was something effortless about Hazel, as if she belonged in every moment she occupied. "Why baking?" he asked suddenly. She paused, considering, "Because it makes people happy." There's something special about creating something that brings comfort to others. He understood that, in a way. His empire was built on control, on power. But there was something about Hazel's world that felt real. Before he could say anything else, a distant rumble of an engine broke the quiet. The tow truck. Hazel glanced out the window. "Looks like your ride's here," Graham exhaled. He should be relieved. Instead, he felt something else, something unnameable. She wiped her hands on a towel and turned to face him. "Well, CEO, it's been interesting," he smirked. "That's one way to put it." They walked outside together. The driver hopped out, nodding toward Graham as he got to work on the car. Hazel crossed her arms, watching. "Guess this is it." Graham studied her for a moment. He hadn't expected any of this to end up here, to meet someone like her. "You ever make it into the city?" he asked. She tilted her head. "Not often." "Why?" He considered his next words carefully. "Because if you do, you should call me." Hazel smiled, something unreadable in her expression. "Maybe." The car was ready. The driver waved him over. Graham hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Thanks for the hospitality, Hazel." She lifted a hand in farewell. "Safe travels, Graham." He got into the car, pulling onto the road. In the rearview mirror, he saw her standing there, framed by the morning light, watching as he disappeared down the winding road. And for the first time in a long time, leaving somewhere didn't feel like moving forward. It felt like leaving something behind. Graham sat in the back of the sleek black town car, watching the countryside blur past the window as he made his way back to the city. The tow truck had gotten his car running again, and his assistant had arranged for a driver to meet him at the nearest service station. Everything was back in motion, every detail handled with the efficiency he expected. And yet, something felt off. His assistant was talking, rattling off his schedule for the day, but Graham wasn't listening. His mind kept drifting back to Hazel, to the way she had smiled at him as he left, to the quiet warmth of her home. He had spent one night in her world, and yet it lingered with him in a way that didn't make sense. The city skyline came into view, the towering buildings cutting through the afternoon haze. Back to reality. Back to the empire he had built. By the time he stepped into his penthouse, the sense of disconnection had only grown. The silence here was different, sterile, lacking the warmth of Hazel's lived-in space. He set his keys on the marble counter, exhaling as he loosened his tie. He had work to do, meetings to attend, deals to close. He had no reason to be thinking about a woman who lived in a world so far removed from his own. And yet that night, as he lay in his king-sized bed with the city lights flickering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Hazel's voice echoed in his mind. "Maybe you should slow down." For the first time in years, Graham wondered if she was right. The following week passed in a blur of boardrooms and late-night calls. Graham buried himself in work, pushing aside the nagging thoughts that kept creeping in. It was ridiculous. He had met Hazel for a single night. He barely knew her. And yet, when he found himself walking past one of the city's high-end bakeries between meetings, he paused. The display window was filled with elaborate pastries, delicate and precise. Technically perfect, but something about it felt hollow. Hazel's words surfaced again, "because it makes people happy." Without thinking, he pulled out his phone. He didn't have her number, he hadn't asked for it, but he had resources. Within minutes, his assistant had found the name of Hazel's bakery, a small shop in town simply called Hazel's Hearth. He stared at the name for a long moment before making a decision. 2 hours later, Graham was stepping out of his car onto the quiet main street of Hazel's town. It was a stark contrast to the city, no towering skyscrapers, no rush of people glued to their phones. Just a few small shops, a cafe with outdoor seating, and a bookstore that looked like it had been there for decades. And then there was Hazel's Hearth. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla wafted through the air as he pushed open the door. Inside, the space was small but inviting, with wooden shelves displaying freshly baked pastries and a glass case filled with golden croissants and delicate tarts. A few customers sat at small tables, chatting over coffee, and behind the counter, moving with effortless precision, was Hazel. She hadn't seen him yet. She was focused on kneading dough, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her hands. There was something captivating about the way she worked completely in her element, completely unaware of the world beyond this moment. Then she looked up. For a second, her hands stilled. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something unreadable. He hadn't thought this through. He hadn't planned what he would say. But then Hazel arched an eyebrow. "Did your car break down again?" Graham smirked. "Not this time." She wiped her hands on a towel, stepping around the counter. "So, what brings you to my side of the world, CEO?" There was a teasing lilt to her voice, but he could see the curiosity in her eyes. "I wanted to see the famous bakery for myself," he said. Hazel studied him for a moment before nodding toward a table. "Sit. If you came all this way, you might as well try something." A few minutes later, she placed a plate in front of him. A warm cinnamon roll, perfectly golden, the icing melting into the swirls of dough. Graham took a bite. The flavors were rich, balanced, familiar yet unlike anything he had tasted before. Hazel watched him expectantly. "Well," he set down his fork, meeting her gaze. "You weren't exaggerating," she grinned. "Told you," he leaned back. "So, is this what you do all day?" "Bake and make people happy," Hazel shrugged. "Pretty much. It's not glamorous, but it's mine." There was pride in her voice, a quiet certainty that made something shift in Graham's chest. "And you never wanted more?" he asked. She gave him a look. "Define more," he gestured vaguely. "Bigger, expansion, a franchise, you're good at what you do." "You could turn this into something much larger." Hazel tilted her head, considering. "Maybe, but I don't want to lose what makes this special. I like knowing my customers." "I like that this place feels personal." Graham studied her. She was different from anyone he had ever met. Most people wanted more success, more power, more recognition. But Hazel was content in a way that was unfamiliar to him. And for the first time, he wondered if he was the one who was missing something. She crossed her arms. "So did you just come here for a pastry, or is there another reason you showed up in my shop?" He hesitated. "Maybe I wanted to see you again." Hazel blinked, caught off guard for the first time. Then she smiled, slow and knowing. "Well, CEO, I guess you'll have to keep coming back to find out if that was a good idea or not." Graham chuckled. "I guess I will." And just like that, he knew this wasn't the last time he'd find himself in Hazel's world. Graham had never been one for distractions. His life was built on precision, on control. There was no room for unnecessary detours. And yet, over the past 2 weeks, he had found himself in Hazel's bakery more times than he cared to admit. At first, he had convinced himself that he was simply curious. Hazel was unlike anyone he had ever met, unapologetically content in a way that defied logic. He wanted to understand her, to figure out what made her tick. But the more time he spent in her world, the harder it became to lie to himself. He liked being around her. That realization was both intriguing and unsettling. Today, he arrived just as the morning rush was dying down. The scent of freshly baked bread hung in the air, and Hazel was behind the counter, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she boxed up an order. When she saw him, her lips curved into a smirk. "Back again," she teased, sliding a tray of golden pastries onto the display case. Graham leaned against the counter, ignoring the amused glance from an elderly woman seated by the window. "You act surprised." Hazel wiped her hands on a towel. "I'm starting to think you don't actually have a job." He arched an eyebrow. "I delegate," she laughed, shaking her head. "Must be nice." Before he could respond, the door swung open, and a man stepped inside. He was around Hazel's age, with an easy smile and a familiarity in the way he walked straight up to her. "Hey, Hazel," the man said, resting his elbows on the counter. "Got that special order ready?" Hazel nodded, reaching beneath the display case for a box tied with twine. "Just finished this morning." The man grinned. "You're a lifesaver." Graham watched the exchange, an unfamiliar irritation creeping into his chest. It wasn't jealousy, that would be ridiculous. And yet, there was something about the casual way this man leaned into Hazel's space that made his jaw tighten. Hazel handed over the box. "Tell your mom I said hi." "Will do." The man glanced at Graham then, his expression turning curious. "Friend of yours?" Hazel hesitated for half a second before answering. "Something like that," Graham smirked. "Graham Caldwell." The man's brows lifted slightly as if recognizing the name. "Ethan Carter." He extended a hand and Graham shook it, his grip firm. Ethan turned back to Hazel. "I'll see you later." "Probably," she said lightly. With that, Ethan exited the shop, leaving a strange silence in his wake. Graham didn't speak immediately. He wasn't sure why it bothered him, but he didn't like the feeling. Hazel, however, seemed perfectly unbothered, moving to refill the coffee station. "Old friend?" Graham asked, keeping his tone neutral. Hazel glanced up. "Yeah, we went to high school together. His family owns the farm outside town." He nodded, filing the information away. "Seems close." She narrowed her eyes slightly, as if reading something in his tone. "Ethan's like a brother to me." The tightness in Graham's chest loosened, though he didn't acknowledge why. He changed the subject. "You ever think about leaving this town?" Hazel wiped down the counter before answering. "I did once." The admission surprised him. "What stopped you?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I realized I didn't need to leave to find what I wanted." Graham studied her. "And what is it you want?" Hazel met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "Something real." The words sat between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was ready to unpack. Before he could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and a new customer walked in. Hazel turned to greet them, slipping effortlessly back into work mode. Graham exhaled slowly, stepping back. He had come here looking for answers, but all he had found were more questions. And the most pressing one of all, why did he care so much? Graham wasn't prone to second-guessing himself. His decisions were calculated, his instincts sharp. That was how he had built his empire, by knowing exactly what he wanted and executing without hesitation. But Hazel was an anomaly. He had left her bakery that day intending to put distance between them, to let curiosity fade into nothing more than a passing thought. Instead, he found himself back in her town 3 nights later, sitting in his car outside Hazel's hearth long after closing hours, staring at the darkened windows like a man who had lost all sense of reason. This was ridiculous. With a frustrated sigh, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the side entrance of the bakery. Light glowed faintly from the back window, suggesting she was still there. He knocked once, a pause, then footsteps. The door cracked open, Hazel's face appearing in the dim light. She blinked in surprise. "Graham," he exhaled, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "You still working?" She studied him for a moment before stepping back, allowing him inside. The warmth of the bakery wrapped around him, carrying the scent of sugar and butter. Though the trays were empty, the counters wiped clean. "I was just finishing up," she said, closing the door. Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Graham leaned against the counter, watching as she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Neither did I." Hazel's lips quirked, but she didn't press. Instead, she grabbed a small container from the counter and pried off the lid, revealing a cluster of chocolate dipped biscotti. "Since you're here, you might as well taste test," she said, holding one out. Graham took it without question, biting into the crisp edge. The chocolate melted smoothly against the crunch of almonds, the flavor balanced, precise. He nodded. "You could charge double for these." Hazel laughed softly. "Not everything is about the highest price tag, you know," he smirked. "Says the woman who could turn this place into a chain if she wanted to." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she perched herself on the edge of the counter, swinging her legs slightly. "So, what's really on your mind, CEO?" Graham hesitated. He wasn't a man who confided in people. There was no room for vulnerability in his world. But Hazel had a way of disarming him, of making him forget why he usually kept his walls so high. "I don't know," he admitted, which wasn't entirely a lie. Hazel studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she hopped down from the counter, moving to the small espresso machine in the corner. "You drink coffee this late?" "Depends." She poured 2 cups anyway, sliding one toward him. "I won't ask why you're really here. But you don't seem like the kind of man who drives out of the city for no reason." Graham wrapped his fingers around the warm mug, considering her words. She wasn't wrong. He took a sip, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue. "You ever feel like you're standing in the middle of your life, and for the first time, you're not sure if it's what you actually want?" Hazel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned against the counter, her gaze flickering toward the darkened window. "Once," she finally said, "a long time ago." Graham waited for her to continue, but she didn't. Instead, she turned back to him, her voice softer now. "What changed?" he exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet." They stood there for a moment, the quiet between them not uncomfortable but charged with something unspoken. Finally, Hazel set her mug down. "Come with me." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed a set of keys and headed for the door. Graham followed, curiosity outweighing reason. Outside, the air was crisp, the streets empty under the glow of streetlights. Hazel led him away from the bakery, down a narrow path that wound between buildings until they reached a small wooden dock overlooking the river. The water was still, reflecting the moonlight in shimmering ripples. Hazel leaned against the railing, her arms resting on the worn wood. "Whenever I feel stuck, I come here." Graham stood beside her, looking out over the water. "And does it help?" She smiled faintly. "Sometimes. It reminds me that the world keeps moving, no matter what." He absorbed her words, the simplicity of them somehow more profound than any advice he'd ever received in business meetings or boardrooms. For a man who had spent his life chasing success, it was a strange thing to consider that maybe happiness wasn't about moving faster, but about knowing when to stop. Hazel turned to him then, her expression thoughtful. "You don't always have to have the answers, Graham." He met her gaze, something in his chest tightening at the way she said his name, like it wasn't attached to the weight of his empire but simply his. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe she was right. Graham wasn't sure what exactly had shifted in the past few weeks, but something had. He felt it in the way he kept checking his phone, half expecting a message that would never come because he had never actually given Hazel his number. He felt it in the way his office, with its panoramic view of the city skyline, suddenly felt suffocating. He had spent his life making decisions with ruthless precision, yet when it came to Hazel, nothing made sense. He wasn't the kind of man who chased things uncertain, yet here he was, driving out of the city yet again, toward a town that had no reason to call him back except for her. This time, he didn't go to the bakery. He had learned by now that Hazel wasn't just a woman who existed within the walls of her shop. If he wanted to understand her, to figure out why she had unsettled something in him, he needed to see her outside of it. He parked near the town square, stepping out onto the cobblestone path. The streets were alive tonight. String lights hung across the trees, and small stalls lined the sidewalks, selling handmade crafts and local goods. It wasn't elaborate or extravagant, but the energy of it felt real. People greeted each other by name, laughter carried through the cool evening air, and for the first time in a long time, Graham felt like an outsider. And then he saw her. Hazel stood near a stall selling fresh honey, her hands wrapped around a cup of something warm. She wasn't in her apron, wasn't covered in flour or moving with the focused purpose he had grown used to seeing in her bakery. Here she was just Hazel at ease, surrounded by people who knew her, who belonged in her world. And he was suddenly aware that he didn't. She caught sight of him before he could decide whether to turn away. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by something unreadable. He wasn't sure if she was pleased to see him or puzzled by his presence, but either way, she didn't ignore him. She excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked toward him, her expression guarded but not unwelcoming. "I didn't take you for the type to enjoy small town festivals," she said, tilting her head slightly. Graham glanced around. "I didn't realize I was attending one until I got here," she smirked. "And yet here you are. I wanted to see you." The words came out before he could filter them, and he could tell by the way her expression flickered that she hadn't expected them. Hazel shifted, wrapping her fingers tighter around her cup. "You always get what you want, don't you?" Graham exhaled slowly. "Usually." She studied him for a moment before nodding toward the path leading deeper into the festival. "Come on." He fell into step beside her, the sounds of the town filling the space between them. They passed more stalls, handcrafted jewelry, a table of books with handwritten notes tucked into their pages, a stand selling candles with scents named after local landmarks. "This is what you left behind?" Graham asked, watching the way Hazel greeted people with familiarity, the way she seemed to belong here effortlessly. She glanced at him. "What do you mean? You said you once thought about leaving," she exhaled, kicking a stray pebble with the toe of her boot. "I did. But I realized that chasing something bigger didn't necessarily mean finding something better." Graham rolled her words over in his mind. It was such a foreign concept to him. He had spent his life pushing forward, reaching for more. The idea of choosing to stay, of choosing to let something be enough, was almost unfathomable. "And you never regretted it?" he asked. Hazel was quiet for a moment, as if considering how honest she wanted to be. "Not in the way you think. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had left, but I don't regret staying." They reached the edge of the festival where the lights dimmed and the noise softened. A wooden bench sat beneath a tall oak tree, and Hazel sank onto it, motioning for him to sit beside her. Graham hesitated but joined her, stretching his legs out in front of him. "You're different here," he said after a moment. Hazel turned to him, one eyebrow raised. "Different how?" "Less guarded." She huffed out a quiet laugh. "That's rich coming from you," he smirked. "Fair." They fell into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Then Hazel spoke, her voice quieter now. "You keep coming back." Graham didn't look at her immediately. He wasn't sure he wanted her to see the answer in his expression before he could find the words for it himself. "I do," he admitted. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer wasn't as easy. He could have given her a dozen logical reasons: curiosity, business, a change of pace, but none of them were true. Instead, he turned to her, meeting her gaze head-on. "Because I don't want to leave yet." Hazel inhaled softly, something flickering behind her eyes, but she didn't look away. And for the first time in a long time, Graham realized that maybe he didn't have to keep moving forward to find what he was looking for. Maybe, for once, staying still was enough. The air between them had shifted. Hazel could feel it in the way Graham had spoken those words, because I don't want to leave yet. He wasn't a man who lingered, who hesitated, and yet here he was, sitting beside her in a town that had no place in the world he came from. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The festival lights flickered in the distance, the hum of conversation and music, a soft backdrop to the quiet space they had carved out for themselves. Hazel traced the rim of her cup with her finger, stealing a glance at Graham. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, something steady, unshakable. She exhaled. "You're not going to find the answer to whatever you're looking for here, you know." His lips twitched, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Maybe I'm not looking for answers anymore." Hazel looked away, because if she held his gaze any longer, she might start believing him. She might start believing that a man like him, a man whose world was built on steel and glass and relentless ambition, could want something as quiet, as simple as this. And yet, hadn't he already proved her wrong? Hadn't he come back again and again, despite every logical reason to stay away? She took a slow breath. "You don't belong here, Graham." His jaw tightened just slightly. "And what if I don't care about that?" Hazel shook her head, half in frustration, half in something that felt dangerously close to longing. "This isn't your life. You have an empire waiting for you, and I have this." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "And what if this is the first thing in a long time that's made me feel like I can actually breathe?" Hazel's fingers curled slightly against her lap, her heart thudding unsteadily. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this wasn't just an escape for him, that she wasn't just some fleeting indulgence before he returned to the world that made sense for him. But she also knew better than to hold onto things that were never meant to stay. She forced a small smile, trying to lighten the weight of the moment. "You might regret saying that after you've spent another night in a town where the biggest excitement is the annual pie eating contest." Graham didn't smile back. Instead, his gaze dropped briefly to her hands, where her fingers were still curled against the fabric of her coat. He reached out, hesitating just long enough for her to pull away if she wanted to. But she didn't. His fingers brushed hers warm, solid, grounding. "Try me." Hazel swallowed. The way he was looking at her, the way his touch sent something sharp and aching through her chest, this wasn't casual. This wasn't something either of them could brush off with a laugh and pretend never happened. She turned her hand over, letting her palm rest against his, just for a moment. Then, with a quiet exhale, she stood. Graham followed without question, falling into step beside her as they walked back toward the heart of the festival. The night had deepened, the crowd thinning as families and couples drifted home. Hazel led him through the winding paths between stalls, past the last flickering lanterns strung between the trees, until they reached the quiet stretch of road that led toward the town square. She slowed, glancing at him. "Are you planning on driving back tonight?" Graham shook his head. "No, not tonight." Hazel hesitated, then nodded toward the road ahead. "Come on, then." They walked in silence, the sounds of the festival fading behind them. Hazel wasn't sure what she was doing, wasn't sure if she was making a mistake by letting him in, even for just one more night. But she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not yet. When they reached her house, she unlocked the door and stepped inside, Graham close behind. The warmth of the space wrapped around them, familiar and comforting, but charged with something new now. Something unspoken. Hazel turned her back against the door as Graham stood just a step away. His presence filled the space, his gaze searching hers, waiting. She could stop this now. She could tell him to leave, to let this be nothing more than a moment that never went any further. Or she could take one step forward. She exhaled slowly, and then, before she could talk herself out of it, she closed the space between them. Graham didn't hesitate. His hand slid to her waist, the other cupping her face as he met her halfway. The first brush of his lips was slow, deliberate, like he was giving her the chance to pull away. But Hazel didn't. She pressed closer, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself as the world tilted beneath her feet. Graham inhaled sharply, deepening the kiss, his hand tightening against her waist like he didn't want to let go. And for the first time in a long time, Hazel let herself believe just for this moment that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to let go either. The glow of the streetlights filtered through Hazel's curtains, casting elongated shadows across the wooden floors. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old beams settling in the night. Hazel stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions stirring inside her. Graham was sitting on the couch, his jacket discarded, his shirt slightly unbuttoned at the collar. He didn't look like the untouchable CEO she had first met. He looked different here, softer somehow, as if the weight he carried everywhere else had momentarily been lifted. Neither of them had spoken much since they had stepped inside. The kiss still lingered between them, unspoken but undeniably present, filling the space with something neither of them dared acknowledge just yet. Hazel turned slightly, catching his gaze as he watched her. He didn't look away, didn't try to mask whatever he was thinking. And maybe that was what unsettled her most. Graham Caldwell wasn't a man who let people see past the surface. Yet here he was, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that made sense. She exhaled, forcing a small smile. "You're thinking too much." A slow smirk curved his lips, but there was something thoughtful beneath it. "So are you." She didn't deny it. How could she? Everything about this was unexpected, his presence in her life, the way he kept coming back, the way she let him. She had never been the kind of woman to get caught up in things that had no place in her world. And yet, Graham had slipped in so effortlessly that she hadn't even realized it was happening until it was too late. She walked toward him, hesitating only for a second before sitting beside him. The couch dipped under her weight, and she could feel the warmth of him, close but not quite touching. Graham turned slightly, his fingers brushing against the back of the couch as if debating whether to reach for her. He didn't, but the hesitation in his movements told her he wanted to. "You could leave," she murmured, not looking at him. "You still have time to walk away." "I don't want to." The certainty in his voice sent something sharp through her chest. Hazel turned then, finally meeting his eyes. "You say that now, but what happens when the novelty wears off? When this," she gestured vaguely between them, "stops being an escape?" Graham's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. "You think that's what this is, an escape?" She swallowed hard. "Isn't it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with quiet deliberation. His grip was solid, steady, like he was anchoring himself to her just as much as she was to him. "I don't do things I don't mean, Hazel," he said finally, his voice lower now, rougher. "If I wanted to leave, I would have left by now." Hazel wanted to believe him, but believing meant risking, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. Still, she didn't pull away. Graham's thumb brushed over the back of her hand, slow and deliberate. "Tell me to go," he murmured, "if that's what you want." Hazel opened her mouth, but no words came. Because she didn't want him to go, and the way he was looking at her told her he already knew that. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything neither of them was saying. Then finally Hazel exhaled, her shoulders loosening just slightly. "You're impossible, you know that," Graham smirked, but it was softer this time. "So I've been told." She shook her head, but the fight in her was gone, because the truth was she didn't want to fight this, not anymore. Without thinking, she leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. Graham's breath hitched, but he didn't move away. Instead, his fingers tightened around hers, his other hand rising to cup the side of her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek in a way that sent warmth spreading through her chest. They stayed like that for a long moment, neither of them speaking, neither of them pulling away. And for the first time since this had started, Hazel let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, Graham wasn't going anywhere after all. The morning sunlight spilled through the window, casting soft golden hues over the wooden floors. Hazel stirred, blinking against the brightness, her mind slowly catching up to reality. The warmth beside her was real. The weight of an arm draped over her waist wasn't a dream. Graham was still here. She turned slightly, finding him awake, watching her with a quiet intensity. There was no urgency in his gaze, no impatience, just something steady, something certain. "You stayed," she murmured, still not fully trusting that this wasn't some fleeting illusion. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," he said, his voice low but firm. Hazel searched his face, looking for hesitation, for a sign that he was second-guessing everything, but there was none. He was exactly as he had been the night before, unwavering. A slow exhale left her lips as she let herself believe it. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted in from the kitchen, mingling with the distant hum of town life waking up beyond her window. The world was still moving, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to chase it. Graham sat up, running a hand through his slightly tousled hair. "I should warn you, if I have another one of your cinnamon rolls, I might never leave." Hazel laughed softly, propping herself up on one elbow. "That sounds like a threat." He smirked, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "More like a promise." The weight of his words settled between them, heavier than the light-hearted tone he had used. Hazel swallowed, her fingers absently tracing the fabric of the blanket. "You mean that, don't you?" Graham didn't hesitate. "I do." A part of her wanted to argue, to remind him that his life was in the city, that he had an empire to run. But another part, the part that had spent too many nights wondering what it would feel like to have something real, something lasting, told her to stop fighting it. She inhaled deeply. "So what now?" Graham's expression didn't waver. "That depends on you." Hazel studied him, realizing that for the first time he wasn't the one making the decisions. He was letting her choose. She let the thought settle, then slowly smiled. "I suppose I could find a way to keep you around." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Just say the word, Hazel." She didn't need time to think anymore. She knew. So she reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Stay," Graham exhaled, as if he had been waiting for that single word all along. He squeezed her hand once before pulling her into a slow, deliberate kiss, sealing the decision between them. There were no doubts left, no unanswered questions. For once, everything was exactly as it should be.